This lecture is part of the History 363 Modern Africa class at Flagler College. Our topic today is Independent Africa. And really this lecture will try to take us through the 1960s and 70s, and in many cases into the 1980s and even 1990s, though our focus will be less chronological than topical here. And this is for the reason that as part of this class, in this week of the class specifically, students are required to produce their own presentations on specific countries in Africa in the independence era. And so we can get a pretty good view of things in this period by looking at these individual cases. In fact, if we want to understand African history, we probably need to see this as a collection of nations rather than as a single continent. This lecture will give a kind of synthetic overview of the history of the post-colonial period up to the early 1990s, say, and again, it will do so mostly on a topical basis, and will not, while I will refer to a few examples, they will mostly be oblique references without going into a lot of details so as not to take away from what we hear in the individual student presentations. And it is a requirement this week not only to record your own lecture or your own presentation and post it, but also to watch the presentations of all of your classmates. And those will help form the substance of our discussion boards. So let's talk about the emergence of Africa in the independence era or in the post-colonial era. The emergence of nations. Generally, most African nations achieved independence in the 1950s and 1960s. Some of them, as we talked about in a previous lecture, by peaceful means, by kind of constitutional transfers, as in the case of Ghana. That was sort of the prime example that we gave there. And some of them by force of arms, by fighting long wars against the colonial powers and eventually forcing them out. We gave the examples last time of Algeria and Kenya, though there were lots of other cases as well. In any case, these nations achieved independence mostly in the 1950s and 60s. There were some places where the colonial power lingered longer than that. The Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique, for instance. The British, though not really the British, given that the white settlers had decreed independence in 1965 in southern Rhodesia, which became known later, of course, after independence as Zimbabwe. That lasted all the way until 1980. And then maybe the what is really a kind of outstanding case, something totally out of the norm, is South Africa, where the white government there, the apartheid government, remained in power until 1994, before finally granting or settling upon constitutional terms with the majority population of black Africans and agreeing to hold democratic elections there. And we've already talked about South Africa, so we don't need to get into that a whole lot, except with a few references to the influence of South Africa on some of the other parts of the continent. So that's the general timeline we're dealing with. The other thing that I will say about this is that after the gaining of independence, there was often this kind of honeymoon period in many of these nations where the party that had the leaders and the party that had led them to independence, which often had a kind of military component to it, because especially in those places where they had to fight for independence, they enjoyed high popularity given their status as freedom fighters, with much of the population. This was not always the case. The Congo, for instance, was a mess pretty much from day one. But for a few years at least, these leaders enjoyed great popularity in most African countries. But due to a variety of factors, in many cases the mismanagement and corruption of the government, economic forces that extended outside of the country, and put a lot of pressure on these emerging nations, the pressures that these nations were not very well able to respond to. And so economic troubles, in some cases insurgencies, led to often violent change, cycles of coup d'etat. In the 50-plus years since most of these nations gained independence, there have been, across the continent, several dozen examples of military coup d'etat. Nearly every country in Africa, certainly the majority of them, have suffered from that phenomenon. I'll talk about the militarization of post-colonial Africa in a later slide here. And so, there's a period of kind of euphoria followed by a period of instability. And it wasn't just coup d'etat that hurt these nations. The economic collapse in many cases, due to a variety of factors that I'll talk about later, led them into desperate straits. In some cases, these economic difficulties were compounded by war and or environmental catastrophes like droughts and famines, in particular in parts of Africa, and ultimately led many of these nations into severe crises, or a series of crises that led them to seek outside help. And so from the early 1980s, in many cases, these African countries tried to make changes. These changes were slow in coming in many cases. But I think that there's something to be optimistic about in the longer run of Africa, that some of these essential changes, while difficult in the short term, may lead to greater prosperity in the long run. And there is some evidence that that's already happening in parts of Africa. I don't want to paint this in too rosy a light here. Africa certainly has its problems, but the process of change here is not a rapid one, and to expect Africa to undergo immediate transformation from being colonial subjects in a relatively oppressive system that exploited the land of their countries for outside benefit, or for the benefit of outsiders, to expect them to suddenly transform from that into stable liberal democracies with a well-functioning civil society and educational systems and other things is really ludicrous. No country could do that, whether it's in Africa or on some other continent. It should be borne in mind that it took Europe a couple hundred years, really, in many cases, to transform from relatively, in many cases, authoritarian monarchies into stable democracies. And Europe underwent a series of cataclysms, not least the First and Second World War, before it reached a state of equilibrium. And so for Europeans, or Westerners in general, to look at Africa and say, why haven't you gotten a handle on your corruption and the violence in your society, and why isn't your government stable, and that must be something wrong with Africa, is just totally unfair by historical comparison. Africa was not prepared very well for the establishment of Western-style democracy, yet in some cases they have made that transition quite readily. Okay, so hopefully that gives us some amount of information on the general timeline here. It must be said, and this has been a focus of this class because it's a focus of our textbook author, Reed, to talk about the legacy of the 19th century. The 19th century, as we've seen, was a period of intense creativity, where Africans came up with solutions to meet the challenges they faced, whether it was the overturning of the transatlantic slave trade and the establishment of legitimate commerce, or the incursions of Europeans, or other environmental or cultural or political transformations happening on the continent. Africans met these challenges in increasingly creative ways, though also in frequently very violent ways. And it was the 19th century that created, in many cases, the ethnicities, the tribes, for lack of a better term, that formed the basis of many people's identities. That whole system of creating tribes and political alliances and militarizing the continent and all that stuff that happened in the 19th century had been put on hold to some extent by colonialism. But people still identified with those structures, those conceptions that were put into place in the 19th century because the colonial order, with indirect rule and other parts of the colonial apparatus, reinforced it. So when Africa became independent, the structures that brought about both creativity and violence at the same time were still in place in Africa, in some, at least in most of Africa, kind of defaulted to that. They took up that narrative again. And so the internal tensions created by the formation of these entities, whether political or cultural, were still around and began to make themselves manifest again. The militarization of the continent that happened in the 19th century became one of the defining features of Africa in the post-colonial situation. The participation of Africa in the global economy, begun in the 19th century, was continued after this kind of hiatus where Europe dominated the African economy, continued in, starting in the 1950s. And the creativity in responding to challenges in a variety of ways that were particularly African continued as well, as we'll see. So, we cannot ignore that legacy, but we must also not, in responding to the problems of Africa in recent decades, assume that this was something inherent in Africa itself. This came out of a, kind of timeless setting of tribal violence and things like that. Most of that apparatus was put into place in the 19th century. The Cold War is a tremendously important bit of context to understand Africa in the post-colonial age, at least up until the end of the 1980s. The Cold War was not just a bilateral conflict between East and West, between the United States and its allies in the West and the Soviet Union and its allies, some of them coerced allies, in the East. There was also a North and South component to the Cold War, and this is a kind of label that scholars have placed onto this to describe the phenomenon of these major powers, the two great superpowers in the world, taking an active interest in the affairs of countries outside their immediate sphere of influence, particularly countries in, first of all, in the Southern Hemisphere, and second of all, in the developing world, or in what they called at that time the Third World. The first world being the United States and then the West, the second world being the Soviet Union and its kind of sphere, and the third world being everybody else. That's where that term actually comes from. And so Africa, like parts of Asia and Latin America, ended up being the site of what we may call proxy wars. That is, wars fought over which path that particular society would take, the Western liberal democratic route or the Eastern Soviet communist socialist route. Now, of course, we should not, I mean, we need to be careful with this and recognize that Africans, in their typically creative fashion, so think, the fortunes of Wang Green, just applied on the macro level here. Africans often saw an opportunity to play these powers off against each other and thus come to better circumstances, and they were successful at doing this, at least individually. In some cases, the success they had did not necessarily benefit the collective, but the Africans were not in these proxy wars just passive agents waiting for the Americans or the Soviets to tell them what to do. They actively courted the favor of the two sides, often playing them off against each other to obtain the things that they needed, financial support for national projects, infrastructure and things like that, certainly weapons, to obtain the financial resources or the other kinds of resources that they would need to shore up their power and advance their society, at least according to their vision. And so the Cold War did serve the national interests, or at least leaders who engaged with the Americans and the Soviets in the Cold War used that to serve their interests, their national interests. And it's easy and it was all too easy, all too blithely, in fact, did both Westerners and Easterners look at Africans and simply label them as Western imperialists or as communist stooges. I think of the scene in the movie Dr. Strangelove where the Russian ambassador is talking with an American general, and he says, "I need you to bring me some cigars, Cuban cigars," and the American general says to the Russian ambassador, "Why don't you try one of these Jamaican cigars, ambassador? They're pretty good." And the ambassador replies, "I do not support the work of imperialist stooges." And the general retorts with, "Oh, only commie stooges, huh?" And I think that the word stooges is apropos there because often Westerners and Easterners both, Americans and Soviets both, saw these people as the stooges of their rivals. And so somebody like, I don't know, Mobutu in the Congo would be seen by the Soviets as an imperialist Western stooge, whereas, say, Idi Amin or Nasser or someone else who sought help from the Soviets would be seen as a commie stooge, when in reality, even though these African leaders courted the favor of one or both of these parties in the Cold War, they rarely held any kind of ideological commitment to the models laid down by West or East. Most of these leaders were not ideological. They were self-interested. And if they had to sort of demonstrate some amount of commitment to the Western system or the Soviet system in order to achieve their self-interest, they were willing to do that. But they were not ideologues for the most part. They may have been ideologues of a different stripe, but they were not thinking in terms of democracy or communism. They were thinking about what would serve their own interests. All right, I realize that was a bit wordy and roundabout explanation for that. Hopefully that's clear. We should talk about, at least briefly here, international opinion of Africa. It was really in this period, though with some antecedents in the pre-colonial and colonial era, the tendency of people outside of Africa to create caricatures of Africans. And the Time magazine here, which I actually remember seeing as a child. This is from the 1980s, I believe, late 1980s maybe. I think this was the kind of second phase of the massive drought. that hit the Horn of Africa and led to the international response to try to help these Ethiopians who were dying of starvation. But the starving Ethiopians prompting the writing of "We Are the World" and all of this international attention was part of that image that Africa tended to broadcast. And I don't mean that they did it purposefully. I mean, news out of Africa tended to be more people died today in the war, or more people are dying in the drought, or something like that. And this prompted a lot of international aid. And in many cases, African countries appealed to countries outside of Africa for aid, especially the United States and Europe, in some cases the Soviet Union. And they received it. And, Africa became a kind of cause célèbre, a place that people, who were interested in engaging in humanitarian enterprise would look at because of the endless possibilities, the endless photo opportunities. It also became a kind of symbol of waste because often this international aid was either not distributed effectively, or it only went to serve the interests of those who were in power, and those who really needed it were denied. And so the aid tendency had a double-edged sword. I mean, international aid did serve a very important purpose, or a series of important purposes in Africa in the post-colonial period. International aid helped to prop up governments, in some cases even corrupt governments, governments that would have been threatened otherwise, used the aid, aid as leverage to keep their people at bay, because the aid allowed them to feed more people, or at least use the aid that came in to win popularity among those who were most important in maintaining their as far as maintaining power goes. And so aid served that purpose. This probably was not the purpose for which it was intended, of course. But there were instances where Western institutions could use aid as a means to motivate African countries to make necessary changes, and so we'll talk about some of that too. The question of intervention, especially in African conflict, has always been a big one internationally, and there have been a few instances where the international community has responded to crises in Africa by sending troops. In some cases, these were African countries, though Africa has been in the post-colonial era a place of intense conflict. However, most of this conflict has not been international; it's been within nations. There are a few examples of wars that have spilled over borders, or in a couple of cases, Ethiopia and Eritrea is a good example. Wars that have been fought between countries, though that was really, Eritrea was part of Ethiopia until 1991, so maybe that's not the best example there. There was also, as in the case of the kind of chaotic situation in Somalia in the early 1990s, or the horrors that followed in Rwanda in 1994, one of the great debates held among international diplomats was, do we intervene in Africa or not? And President Clinton sent Marines to Somalia to help distribute aid. 18 of them were killed in an attack on a Black Hawk helicopter. And some of their bodies were dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, and this sparked international outrage and led President Clinton to pull those troops out. And then a few months later, when genocide erupted in Rwanda, the Americans and others were reluctant to send any kind of aid or intervene in any way militarily because of what had happened in Somalia. And then, of course, in hindsight, President Clinton and Madeleine Albright and others admitted that that was the worst mistake that they made in foreign affairs, and in that presidency, and their counterparts in Britain and France and other places said similar things, that they should have intervened to help save the lives of some of the people who were killed in that genocide. So that remains an open question as far as the international relationship between Africa and other continents goes. So where does Africa sit? Maybe that's a question we want to raise at this point, and we can bring it up again in a subsequent lecture. But there certainly is a lot of reason to be pessimistic about the place. The post-colonial era has seen a seemingly endless cycle of war, environmental catastrophe, economic collapse, or at the best stagnation, and a whole litany of other problems, and very few, though there are a few notable success stories. Certainly the end of apartheid in South Africa, which is now 20 plus years old, was, at least in the 1990s, a cause for celebration and a cause to believe that Africa was, as a continent, was making real progress. The Arab Spring in 2011, which hit many of the North African Muslim countries of Africa, was certainly a cause for optimism, though some of the events that have followed the Arab Spring have maybe brought back the pessimism. So there is reason to be optimistic. There's also reason to be very concerned about Africa, and to even perhaps be swayed by the opinion that Africa is hopeless, that there's nothing that can be done for this continent. Again, I think that that's terribly unfair and unjust, and problematic historically, problematic on numerous levels. But I understand, given the images of Africa, why people tend to hold that opinion. Okay, so in this slide and the next slide, I'm going to cover what I think are the two most important facets of post-colonial history. The first is economics, the African economy, and the second is kind of political history, or the political systems of Africa. And then we'll conclude by talking about the problems of militarization and conflict and warfare and things like that. So in the immediate post-colonial era, in the when nations were new in Africa, the goal of these newly formed governments, many of whom were led by those who had fought for freedom, fought for the establishment of their nation, and thus came from a military background, was to do the sorts of things that would allow their nation to prosper. And there were two. I'm going to skip down actually to this point down here, the economic options. There were two options for this. I mean, this is oversimplifying things, but just follow me here. One was to look at the West and the prosperity enjoyed by the West, by Europe and North America, and to try to bring about a situation in Africa, or in the particular country in question, that would imitate the pattern of the West. In other words, many of these African leaders decided that in order to advance their society, they needed to industrialize and mechanize. They needed to build factories. They needed to build, moreover, they needed to build a modern infrastructure with things like an electrical grid, and plumbing systems and water systems, basically to bring about a modern standard of living in their countries. Well, Africa, most of these African countries started from almost nothing, except for the few institutions that had been controlled by Europeans. And so, you know, they were a long way from being able to emulate Europe. The other possibility was to try to do something that was quintessentially African, to Africanize, as it were, their economy. And there were those who attempted that, to not worry so much about you know, trying to follow the model of Europe, but rather do something that was much more in keeping with the traditional way of living and approaching the economy in Africa. Well, both of these approaches led to problems. For the vast majority of countries in Africa, the option was the first, that is to try to industrialize and modernize, to create modern infrastructure. And the way to do that, the way that most of them attempted to do this, was to exploit the most productive sector of their economy. And so in the immediate post-colonial period, kind of the standard rule is a great deal of state intervention. The control of many parts of the economy by the state, even the nationalizing of many of these resources. And so for most African countries, the foundation of the economy was agricultural. And you know, in the 19th century, they had, of course, discovered that they could grow things in Africa that would be held in high demand in other parts of the world. So, you know, palm oil in West Africa was one that wasn't so valuable in the 20th century as it had been in the 19th century, but because of the rise of petroleum-based and synthetic lubricants for machines. But other crops like coffee and sugarcane and cocoa and things like this could be grown very, very well in different parts of Africa. Cloves in Zanzibar. I mean, we could go on and talk about different kinds of crops grown in different places. But these were often very promising sectors of the economy. They were cash crops, though. Rubber is another one, of course, in different parts of Africa. And so the solution of many of these governments was to nationalize agriculture in the sense of imposing very high taxes on rural peasants and creating these things called marketing boards, which told the peasants, first of all, what they should grow and what they would buy from them. They acted as intermediaries between the peasants and the international economy. And they were the ones who also, the marketing boards also set the price that they would pay for the crops that these people grew. Well, these rural African peasants really didn't have any way to establish contact with the outside world to deal directly with those who created demand for their goods, and so they had to work through these marketing boards and through government officials. Well, that the marketing boards often stiffed the peasant farmers, gave them artificially low prices for their commodities, and then turned around and sold those goods on the international market for a much higher price, and the state, whatever shape it was currently in, corrupt or not corrupt, would pocket the rest of the money. Now, the theory here is to use the money that they gain via taxation from the agricultural sector, which was the most productive sector of the economy, to do other things, to build up other parts of the economy, to build factories, to build the infrastructure that would bring Africa into the modern period. And there were some really exorbitant projects attempted. Things like massive hydroelectric dams that were going to be the solution to the lack of an electrical grid in some countries in Africa, for instance. Well, frequently these projects were started on a grand scale, lots of money thrown into them, and then problems came up and they were never finished, either because the state ran out of money and couldn't milk any more from the peasant farmers, or they were receiving outside aid, and that outside aid ceased to come, or they got so deeply into debt that they had to use all of their resources to simply pay their debts rather than further the projects they had started, or in some kind of extreme cases, though there are a few of these, the leaders of these countries simply gave up and said, "There's nothing we can do um, to help our country modernize, and instead we just need to do what we want to do. That is, we, the leaders, we need to look after our own self-interests," and so they ended up pocketing much of the money. And that did happen in a few cases. The best example here is probably Mobutu in the Congo, who used all of the money that he gained from being really the only broker of all of the rich resources the Congo had to offer to the international community, and through really high levels of taxation, through the control of the vast majority of resources, Mobutu was able to achieve a vast personal fortune, built a massive palace for himself in the middle of the jungle, built an airstrip large enough to accommodate the Concorde, the supersonic jet built by the French, which he would then rent from Air France frequently so his wife could go on shopping trips to Paris. Mobutu really is one of the best examples, and if we have a presentation on the Congo, I apologize for mentioning that. Feel free to go back over that territory. In any case, this attempt to transfer the productivity or the results of the productivity from one sector of the economy to help build up others usually didn't work. Something went awry somewhere. Now, it should be said that the same could happen if the most productive sector of the economy was, say, the mineral sector. And so, copper was the most in-demand product offered by Zambia, for instance, and parts of southern Congo, or diamonds in Botswana, or and in Sierra Leone, or other sorts of products in other places. So it could be minerals, and the same process happened largely, which was that the state controlled the export, the sale of these things, effectively taxing the owners of the mines, and except in the case where De Beers did business directly with the government of Botswana, and came up with a arrangement where they shared the profits between them. So the moving of resources, or rather of profit, from one sector of the economy to try to build up the other sectors really did not work for a number of reasons. First of all, the colonial infrastructure was built not to benefit these societies as a whole on a mass level, but to profit the colonial power. That was the whole apparatus that was constructed was intended to do that. The roads, the railroads, the shipping systems, everything was geared toward exporting raw materials back to the metropole where they would be turned into finished products. So the lack of infrastructure, except the infrastructure that would benefit the former colonial power, was a serious challenge to the effort to involve the entire nation in economic advancement. Population growth is a major factor. It's one that is difficult to wrap your mind around, I think. There was an absolute population explosion in Africa in the second half of the 20th century, and this despite all sorts of famines and diseases and other things that compromised that population, sometimes in really horrendous ways. But the population grew exponentially nevertheless. And you know, even if they could build infrastructure for the kind of target level of population, the growth soon outstripped that infrastructure that they were able to build, and I mean, you can see the problem here. They simply could not keep up with all of the ambitions that they had. Another reason why this economic strategy didn't work was that there were simple fluctuations of the price of goods on the global market. And these countries were really not very economically diverse. They tended to rely on only one or two major commodities. And so in parts of West Africa, that was cocoa, for instance, or coffee. Or, again, in Zambia, it was copper. In Sierra Leone, it was, diamonds and other things like that. In Nigeria, especially in the delta region of the Niger River, it was oil. Nigeria has fairly significant reserves of oil, not nearly so much as we find in other parts of the Middle East, but still, a lot of oil, and it's especially good quality oil. It's what's called light sweet crude. So it's a high quality petroleum, and that became the key sector of their economy that they tried to exploit to shore up the other sectors of the economy. And when the price of oil collapsed in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Nigeria really crashed economically. Whereas in the early 1970s, during the energy crisis, because they were producers of oil and they were associated with NATO, the price of oil was really, really high at that point, and they benefited greatly from that. So you can see, how these things would fluctuate. When these newly emergent leaders of these brand new nations laid out their economic plan, they often did it with forecasts that were so rosy as to be, completely unrealistic. And before we start pointing fingers at African politicians and saying that they're, totally unrealistic, I think we probably should look at our own politicians and see that they do very much the same thing. But these global price shifts were often really terrible for the economy of these nations. Neocolonialism means the continued control by usually Europeans of parts of Africa, and that applies mostly to the economy. When they granted independence to these nations, the British, the French, especially those two, not so much the Belgians, the Portuguese were rather late and were ejected violently, but the British and the French had made sure, in most cases, that they maintained a relationship with those who were in power in Africa, and that they would, continue to have special privileges, as it were, in the economy of these nations. Now, this didn't happen in every case. There were some forcible expulsions. There were African leaders who, to get rid of the Westerners, to get rid of the British and the French and their allies, the Americans, began to court the favor of the Soviets, who also, of course, demanded resources like uranium, especially, in return for their aid. But neocolonialism is a phenomenon that continues all the way to the present. There is still a great deal of Western control of sectors of the African economy, and seeing that the Westerners were still benefiting from this, other nations began to get involved. The Soviets, of course. Later on, the Chinese ended up sending not only a lot of aid to African countries, but even a lot of, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of workers to staff the large factories that the Chinese built, because they actually built lots of factories in Africa, but they didn't want to hire Africans because, of the touchiness of being a kind of foreign power, so they would simply bring in huge numbers of Chinese workers to staff these factories for the transformation of the raw materials found in Africa into usable goods. This is one of the reasons that the Chinese control key sectors of the global economy today, is that they built an infrastructure in Africa to extract those resources, and rather than take them back to China, which was already overcrowded and polluted, they built these things in Africa. And so that is in some ways a form of neocolonialism. The Chinese have gotten involved with, economically certainly, in Africa. Environmental issues also presented a grave threat to the plans of these African countries. Whether it was soil erosion or the depletion of nutrients in the soil, the results of climate change, massive droughts in parts of Africa that led to crisis-level famines. The one in Ethiopia in the early 1980s, which was the great celebrity cause of my childhood. I still remember watching all of those stars on the stage at the great Live Aid concert in 1984, singing "We Are the World." It's one of the indelible memories I have, right? And seeing these images of emaciated Ethiopians, especially children, suffering from kwashiorkor, which is that disease that makes the belly distend even as they're starving to death. And so, these environmental issues were very real and presented very serious challenges to the African economy, and not just drought and famine, but also disease outbreaks, as had happened in previous periods of African history, especially things like AIDS in the 1980s and 90s. Ended up in some places killing off huge numbers of people, and that's a phenomenon that's ongoing all the way to the present. We talked about foreign aid already, but relative to the economies of these African nations, foreign aid ended up being a major sector of their economies. It became one that many of these African governments were increasingly reliant on to remain in power, to keep some semblance of stability, because their projects, their overly optimistic projections about what their economy would do, did not come to pass, and in many cases there were economic reversals because they were not terribly diverse in their economies. They were too reliant on single goods. And so they came to rely increasingly on foreign aid, including, and this wasn't all just humanitarian aid, in fact most of it wasn't. They relied very much on loans, either given out by foreign governments or provided by international agencies like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, or perhaps both of those simultaneously. This came with some strings attached, as we'll see. So many of these governments relied too much on foreign aid and too much, certainly, on debt to try to fund these operations. Another challenge to that spelled the doom of the economic plans of many African leaders was governmental corruption, too much state involvement. Many of these places were command economies, and a good example of both the attempt to Africanize the economy and to control a little too much via the state was Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, which tried, in some ways similar to the things that Stalin had done in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s, to form these agricultural collectives. And that's sort of quintessentially African, because Africans, of course, are farmers. This was not bowing to the Western, modernist tendencies, but these state-run agricultural collectives ended up being terribly unproductive, and caused the whole economy of Tanzania to collapse as a result of that. In some cases, governmental corruption was just horrible. There are some African governments in this period that can be labeled accurately. In fact, I think the term originates from this as kleptocracies, government by thieves. Mobutu's Zaire or Congo is probably the best example of that, but there are others. The Central African Republic in the 1970s and 80s is another good example. And we could look at Idi Amin's Uganda and some others, and probably include those in this collection of really terrible situations. And so that was a major problem. I talked about debt already, and this is where we do see a kind of sea change in the early 1980s, under pressure from various, especially Western nations, and with increasing conversation in the United Nations as well, prompting this. The International Monetary Fund, in collusion with the World Bank, began to intervene directly in African economies. By intervene, I mean they told the leaders of these African nations that they were no longer going to provide loans for them, which, of course, these African leaders had become incredibly, all too reliant on. They were no longer going to provide these loans, and instead, unless they met certain conditions. Those conditions were that they needed to reform their economies. In fact, they used the term, the acronym for this is SAP, Structural Adjustment Programs. These were the programs worked out by the IMF, and they were the terms by which they, or to which they held their potential African customers. And usually the SAPs involved the privatization of parts of the economy that had been nationalized and socialized, the exit of the state, things like marketing boards and high levels of taxation, from the economy, turning more and more of it over to the private sector, and permitting laissez-faire economics to actually happen in Africa. This, of course, was a very Western model of things. And many of these countries had little choice but to try to put these structural adjustment programs into place. Almost invariably, the structural adjustment programs created a serious amount of pain, economic pain, because the whole project of many of these nations had been propped up by debt and foreign aid, and the largest employer by far in many of these countries was the government. And as they began to privatize sectors of the economy, that meant that people lost their jobs with the government because it needed to shrink in size. And often, jobs in the private sector were simply not available during this transitionary phase. And so the structural adjustment programs are still, it's safe to say, ongoing in Africa. Many of them are now 30-plus years old. But that has been the model taken by the international community. And it has led to a lot of protests on economic grounds. People talking in Africa, talking about the discrimination of Westerners, the unfair judgments of Westerners, and so forth and so on. Some of this is the rhetoric of these politicians, some of them corrupt in Africa. And so this has led to protest and led to pain. And I don't think that there is a single structural adjustment program that has worked flawlessly. There have been all kinds of problems, all kinds of hiccups along the way. Our discussion of politics is actually much less complicated than the economic discussion, and it flows to some extent from economics. A couple of important phenomena, first of all. First is tribalism, the second is the phenomenon of the big man. Tribalism, as we've talked about, was the creation of, really a product of the 19th century and the early 20th century, the creation of identities which in many cases had not existed previously, or had existed in some form but had not been definitive, crystallized identities. And so, in the 19th century, we see the creation of these identities like Zulu or Hutu or something like that. Again, many of them based on earlier antecedents, but still being formed into something that they hadn't been previously. Well, that was reinforced, as we've seen, by the colonial apparatus, where they used the whole system of tribes to try to make sense of what was going on the ground so they could then impose indirect rule effectively, and that crystallized things even further. So, the identities like Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda and Burundi and Eastern Congo were reinforced by the Belgians, who, forced people to carry identification, which included their ethnicity. To determine that ethnicity, they would look at their physical characteristics like the darkness of their skin, their height, and the width of their noses. And so that reinforced this tribalism. Well, those tribal identities had, by the time of independence in many parts of Africa, become really definitive. Had become the essential identity of many of the people. To some extent, the revolutions that led to independence, the wars for independence, were fought along tribal lines, or there was a tribal element to those conflicts, to the leaders. Well, for nations, many of whom held within their very artificial boundaries lots of different groups, ethnic, linguistic, religious groups, whose identities were now reinforced by this whole notion of tribalism, well, you can see that that would be a volatile thing. Whoever happens to be in power tends, I'm using the present tense, I really should be using the past tense here, whoever has been in power has tended, this is not universal, but there are lots and lots of cases, tended to support at an outsized rate those who were part of their own ethnic identity. The other phenomenon is the phenomenon of the big man. In these independent nations, frequently, the leader who had led the nation to independence ended up establishing a kind of, well, on the one hand, a cult of personality, and on the other hand, an absolute stranglehold on power within the nation. The person pictured here is Joseph Mobutu, or as he came to call himself, Mobutu Sese Seko. This was a kind of crass Africanization of his own name. Really, it's sort of made up, but he also renamed Congo Zaire because it sounded more African, even though that was a term that originated with the Portuguese colonial effort. Mobutu wore African-style garb. His signature piece was this leopard skin hat that he wore on ceremonial occasions anytime he was in the company of an international leader. We have lots of pictures of Mobutu sitting in company with Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, probably with other American presidents and other world leaders, but he's always wearing this leopard skin cap, right? And so they create this cult of personality at the same time as they put a stranglehold on the politics. This is an extension, to some extent, again, of the 19th century, of the creation of these large kingdoms like Uganda, or the kingdom of Buganda, and the Sokoto Caliphate, and other things like that, or the empire of Shaka Zulu, for that matter. And so there are precedents here. Well, that was reinforced during the colonial period by the apparatus of indirect rule, and in the post-colonial era, it was a natural fit for many of these leaders. Unfortunately, many of these big men were also very corrupt. Mobutu is Exhibit A for that corruption. And so what was nationhood? This is a complicated question. We've already talked a lot about nationalism in a previous lecture. But nationhood in Africa was difficult, given the randomness of the colonial boundaries. And it is ironic, by the way, that most of these post-colonial governments, even though they certainly recognized the problems of the boundaries, insisted on territorial integrity. So much that any attempt to break away and form a new nation was often met with a violent resistance. There was an outbreak of conflict almost immediately post-independence, for instance, in Sudan in the 1950s, a conflict that extended all the way till fairly recent times. I mean, this lasted 50 years until the granting or the achieving of independence via referendum by South Sudan. That was a long, protracted battle, and really the problem there was that the people who lived in the southern part of the colony, the British colony of Sudan, had nothing in common with the people who lived in the northern part of the western part. They were not Muslim. They didn't share any kind of ethnicity or any linguistic commonality or anything like that, and yet the colonial boundaries had included all these people. Well, those colonial boundaries, ironically, died very hard in Africa in the post-colonial situation. Another really good example was Nigeria. Nigeria had 3 major regions and ended up being organized regionally, as I said in a previous lecture. And but in the late 1960s, the southeastern region, where the Igbo people were the predominant group, ended up declaring independence and trying to break away, and there was a bloody civil war that probably claimed more than 1 million lives fought in order to preserve the territorial integrity of that country. Well, truth be told, they wanted to do that because in Biafra, which is what the Igbo called their breakaway country, that was where all the oil was, and thus the most important commodity that Nigeria had to offer. So it's perhaps understandable that they fought so hard to retain that part of the country. So identity was tricky, and I mean, there's a lot more we could say about national identity. In some cases, this came rather naturally. In places that were ethnically relatively homogeneous, they began to identify with their nation. So this is certainly the case in Botswana, for instance, where the vast majority of people are native Tswana, Botswana. Same thing probably in Lesotho and Swaziland and places like that. And so, again, ethnically homogeneous places didn't struggle with this so much, but places that where there were competing forms of identity had a difficult time pulling people together as a nation. Power monopolies were the thing that held these nations together in many cases. The whole apparatus surrounding the big man, and most of these places, even if there were democratic elections, ended up being relatively autocratic. This is the case with Ghana, which had started out with so much promise under Kwame Nkrumah, ended up being quite authoritarian, very much a command economy, certainly by the mid-1960s when Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in a military coup. Unfortunately, and this is the source of a great deal of conflict and a great deal of inequity in Africa, ethnic favoritism was often the political motivation or the political goal for many of these leaders, as we've talked about. And so, Idi Amin in Uganda, for instance, came from a relatively small ethnic group in Uganda, and after he became this supreme dictator in Uganda, he ended up doing a great deal to suppress every other ethnicity, even carrying out massacres of rivals, and did everything he could to bring privilege to the people who shared his ethnicity. That's an extreme case of ethnic favoritism, but it's not so far out of the norm that we, shouldn't discuss it at all. What were the governmental options that Africans had? Well, when the British and French and Belgians left, they said you really need a parliamentary system designed after English Parliament or the French Assembly or the U.S. Congress or something like that. And they tried to put such things in place. There were often elections to that end. But Africa was not a place, as I've said earlier, a place that was accustomed to liberal Western-style democracy. And to the presence of something that we might call civil society. Civil society is the whole apparatus that is apolitical. And so if you consider the elements of civil society in the United States of America, we have an army, and it doesn't matter which party is in power, the army is still loyal to the government. It is not tied to the party. We have police and firefighters and a healthcare system and lots of other things. A civil bureaucracy that is diverse in its political leanings and tends to yet still is loyal to whatever government happens to be in power and enacts the policies passed by the parliamentary system. Well, that's very much a Western creation. Africa at independence had no civil society, no tradition of civil society, no imagination to incorporate civil society. And so it's only understandable that authoritarianism came much more naturally and ended up being the option that many of these African countries leaned toward, or at least that's how things turned out for them. In Northern Africa, another political factor was Islam, of course, and the desire to impose Sharia law on the population, and so Islamism was a major factor, and it sort of weaves in and out of this whole story of the growth of authoritarianism and the presence of single party systems. Political parties in Africa in the post-colonial period were, for the most part, and I'm generalizing maybe a bit too much here, for the most part descended from or the natural outgrowth of the party that had led the country to independence in the first place. In other words, the freedom fighters, some of them guerrilla warriors, took over the governments. And guerrilla warriors, military leaders, do not always make the best civil service governors. They don't always, transition to civilian rule very well. And so the party became an end rather than a means. The party became the single most important thing propping up many of these corrupt governments in Africa, for instance. The party, often employed its own militia, for instance. And, a lot of the corruption happened in the party. And, given that political parties were not necessarily present during the colonial period, and usually were, again, outgrowths of the single movement for independence, when these nations became independent, they only had a single party. And these parties were very reluctant to let anyone else into the political arena. And so most African countries remained single-party systems. Well, people became very tired, very upset with the single parties when they didn't meet their needs, when they failed to build the infrastructure, failed to keep the promises they had made, partly for economic reasons, partly due to corruption and kleptocracy and things like that. And so the insurgency movements and the resulting civil wars in many of these countries happened, including the coup d'état. The coups d'état happened because people were fed up with the single party and wanted people power, we might say. But it was frequently the case that once the former leader had been overthrown by a coup d'etat, that what was instituted really was not much better. It was either a rule by the military leaders who had enacted the coup d'etat, or if they made the transition into a civilian government, they frequently acted in ways that were similar to those they had overthrown. And so many of these governments were also propped up by outside support, by foreign aid and other things which they exploited for their own purposes. Finally, militarization in Africa, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, though, that it is a major factor. I'll return to this in a subsequent lecture to talk about, things like the Rwandan genocide and lots of different wars and things like that in relatively recent times. The 19th century saw the initial militarization of the continent. We've already talked about that, and so again, this is that was put to some extent on hiatus during the colonial period, though, as we've seen, the colonial powers often did create armies of indigenous peoples, and so Africa was already armed, and they were ruled quite naturally then by military leaders. With the lack of civil society, the military ended up often being associated with the single-party system, and ended up being a means to procure and obtain power. Professional armies were loyal to whoever paid them, and if the party was paying, or the party leaders were paying the army, they tended to be loyal to them. If the military leaders felt they were being stiffed by the party, then they would overthrow them in a coup d'etat with the excuse that they were simply trying to meet the needs of the people who were dependent on them, in other words, their own soldiers. And so this whole cycle of coup d'etat, which has plagued Africa since independence. There are various justifications for coup d'etat. One of them is that the military needs of the society are not being met, and so the military has to take action to make sure that their own, they're claiming their own, as it were. But justifications were also frequently that the government was corrupt, or it was ineffectual, or, and the military was an outgrowth of the will of the people. And in some cases that was true. In 2011 in Egypt, for instance, not to take away from any presentations on Egypt here, but after the Arab Spring, the military took over, and the military was actually quite popular, much more popular than the dictator Hosni Mubarak had been, and so people welcomed the army. But then the army, had a difficult time, still has had a difficult time. They're still kind of in power. I'm filming this in 2016, and that's still the case. But they were very reluctant to give up the power that they had obtained. And so the results frequently were just more of the same. That the leaders of the coup, whether military or making the transition to civilian rule, did things that then sparked a new cycle of coup d'etat. Given the proliferation of weapons, now I've pictured on the slide here the Kalashnikov rifle, or the AK-47 as it's known, which was a Russian invention that has been produced subsequently by the Chinese rather cheaply. This is a fully automatic rifle that will keep firing even after it's been submerged in water or filled with sand, or you just clean it out or drain it out and it fires again. An incredibly resilient weapon. It doesn't give a lot of kick or recoil, which means that even a small person, a child say, can hold this and fire it. Well, this is one of the key factors in the rise of insurgencies in many parts of Africa. Dissatisfaction with ruling governments has led groups, often there's an ethnic association to this, to break away, form their own militias, often, again, ethnically based, and to try to overthrow the government. If they are able to obtain weapons, and these things can be obtained very cheaply, not just the AK-47, but also machetes and things like that, which have been the main weapons used in many of the atrocities, including the Rwandan genocide in recent times in Africa.
But if these groups, which militarize and obtain weapons, are then able to seize control of some resources, if they get control of a diamond mine, say, or a mine for cobalt or coltan or one of these rare earth minerals that is in such high demand because they are used in electronics in the modern age and things like that, then these insurgencies, bush armies, we might call them, can obtain their own funding and perpetuate their existence and recruit more people, either through charisma or coercion. And the coercion is one of the saddest parts of this, because there have been countless people in Africa, including lots of children, whose parents have been killed in fighting between insurgent groups and ruling governments, or between two different insurgent groups, or, I mean, these conflicts often in places like Liberia and Sierra Leone and Uganda and the Congo and Central African Republic. I'm just giving the most problematic areas of the continent. Somalia is another one. You know, so many people have been killed, and if children, if children have been left alone, they've been orphaned, are caught up in this and taken captive by one or another of these groups, whether it's associated with the government or its insurgency. They have frequently brainwashed them by telling them that those who killed their families were their enemies, and they brainwash them. They, in many cases, get them addicted to drugs, marijuana or some combination, some opiate combination of things. Hand them a Kalashnikov rifle, and these poor children become killing machines, brainwashed killing machines. There's a lot more that we could say about the child soldier phenomenon. I do teach a class periodically called War and Genocide in Africa, where we spend a great deal of time talking about child soldiers in Africa. But that's part of the human cost here. So these insurgencies are able to rule from the bush, have their own resources and the land territory they control based on their access to resources and weapons and such things. And this is one of the things that has produced the greatest instability in Africa. There are things to be optimistic about. In the 1970s, African nations came together to create a body called the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which served as a diplomatic broker for conflict, mostly interstate conflict, which was less common by far than civil war, sorts of things, or insurgencies within countries, which the OAU rarely stepped into. But it did do a lot to, try to head off conflict between countries. And the AU, or the African Union as it's called, which was formed, I think, in the late 80s, early 1990s, I'm not sure the exact year, has served even a more direct peacekeeping role at times, sometimes working together with the United Nations, or acting under the auspices of the United Nations, or with the support of the United Nations. The AU has actually sent troops into high conflict zones like Sierra Leone in the 1990s and the early first decade of the 21st century, Liberia, more recently Central African Republic and Southern Sudan and places like that, and they have tried in some way to keep the peace, and in some cases been partly successful at that. So there is hope for this, but militarization has been a major problem, a major source of instability, a major source of conflict, and I think probably will continue for some time to fill that role. Okay, well, that brings this lecture to an end. We can discuss these matters in the discussion.